Hello, my name is Evan Schwartz. This is BattleCry Milestone 7. This week we're going to do a little bit of a change up in the video recording. We got a little wrapped up in the individual parts and pieces and didn't get a chance to or forgot to show the application running on a different device. So this week we're going to go through the milestone like we've done in previous weeks. Then we're going to quickly go through end-to-end these pieces on an Android device, and then we'll switch back and look at each individual task associated with milestone 7, doing a recording on the iOS environment, and then going through the code review. So let's take a quick look at what we have here in milestone 7. We've done a lot of work around the visual battle cry. You're going to see it a little bit more intuitive. It doesn't surprise the user. One of the common problems is when they would hit the button to record the battle cry, a dialog would pop up, say, record your battle cry. By the time they'd read it and understood what it was they were supposed to be doing, the recording time of 3 seconds was already over. So we've upgraded that user experience. It presents a dialogue, gives the user the opportunity to prepare themselves, and then select to record the battle cry. We're outputting a real-time waveform around that recording. We're tracking against it, and we're counting down 3 seconds down to 0. So hopefully all of that will help the player understand a little bit more what it is they're supposed to be doing. In-game transaction system. This is really phase 1 of 2 of the in-game transaction systems. There's 2 pieces to it. There's the piece as I'm navigating around the map and I encounter a territory I don't own. If there's a battle cry associated with whatever the last battle cry was on that hex, it should autoplay that to me, just to, again, to connect me to my other player and get me a little bit familiar with listening to my other players' battle cries. Intuitive combat movement upgrade, task 3061. That involves when the player got into the game previously, it would highlight their castle hex, and boy, what do we do from there? And the mechanic in the game isn't complicated, but if you don't know what to do, it can get really frustrating. So essentially you select a source hex, you select a destination hex, and depending on the destination hex, whether it's yours or not yours, you're either attacking it, reinforcing it, or if you just select a single hex, you're buffing it. So we did a lot of work this week trying to upgrade that affordance to give the user some sort of motivation to, hey, now that you've got a hex selected, here are some surrounding hexes that may be of interest to you, and highlights. The original spec write-up was to highlight those in a color. I have a challenge with color personally. We're using color so much in the screen. It really, and again, at the end of the day, it didn't tell the user what to do. So I went a little off grid on that and actually put some icons up there. Hopefully that'll give the player a little bit more affordance of what each one of those things they're trying to do, or at least enough to be able to figure it out. This is the first milestone where we've added some sound. So there was a lot of work in building out an audio manager and plugging and playing a lot of the puts and takes for the sound, setting up the equalizer pieces for all of the background music, sound music, and getting all that taken care of. That just ended up taking a lot longer than expected. Unfortunately, my iOS device is all updated this week, making me not compatible with my Xcode project, and that just, it went a little over rails. So you'll notice this week, due to that unexpected event, I had a few extra hours than were originally guesstimated in getting it built out. During development, I found a bug when selecting friendly sectors, so took care of that. We'll dig into what that was. There was some backlog items from previous milestones, some typos and things. It just so happens I was in the area. I wasn't really targeting this, but I remembered it from last week, so I was able to take out some of the typos and some of the textual issues, and I'm sure there's more. We'll continue to dig into that. There was some text components underneath the buttons. I targeted the one that was identified, which was in the new game. I found a couple of others throughout as I was just digging around, and again, I'm sure there's still some more of those. So that'll be sort of an ongoing task. Better affordances around each list category. Took another stab at describing those lists, and we've got it where it's navigating in, but players are still very confused between a pending and an open list, so I made it a little bit more obvious. That one wasn't too difficult. And then the game identification was another big one this week. On the main active list, rather than just having an icon to play, if it's me and you playing 5 different games and I'm the aggressor and you're the challenger, how do you know what game is which between the 5 of us? You just have 5 of them. So what we did is we changed the play button into a rendition of the map, hoping to get a little bit of recognition between the layout of water and mountains. And we did some watermarking on whether it's a playable button versus a non-playable button. Again, trying to instill some heavy affordances to give the players some things to do. So that's the Milestone 7. We're going to go over that. We're going to look at all these features end-to-end on the Android next, and then we'll dive in and we'll dissect each one of these. Thank you. Hello, my name is Evan Schwartz, and this is Milestone 7 BattleCry video. We're going to take a look at the Android device, and we're going to go through the various tasks and issues associated with Milestone 7 fairly quickly today, ultimately just to be able to demonstrate the functionality working on another device. The other thing to notice is that we used to do this with the AT&T Android tablet, but I had some feedback that the NVIDIA Shield tablet was struggling, so I switched my development over to using this tablet. This tablet's about 15 times more powerful than my AT&T tablet, so I was rather surprised to hear that it was having problems, but I thought, hey, better do it while we can. So right off the bat, one of the things that you're going to hear, I've done this video a couple of times at this point, and the sound was quite protruding on the first 2 recordings, so I've turned it down low. So I'm just going to be quiet here for a minute and give you a second to hear that. So that's the background music, and that's essentially all that's significantly going on this week from the title screen. You'll notice that you can hear the clicks and ticks as you're poking around the various buttons. And there's various sounds and features throughout the entire game, and we'll be able to see those as we go through, and that'll be task 3062. One of the top tasks in this milestone was to upgrade the BattleCry process to be more visual. So we'll go over here to new. So as it pops up, you'll see that this is the new BattleCry dialog that pops up. Press button to record BattleCry. This is to give the users a little bit of opportunity to prepare for what they're about to do. You'll notice that it has a 3-second counter, and this white-ish window is where the waveform will play out. So I've had a little bit more practice now, so I'm going to try to initiate the BattleCry while recording and yelling into my phone. So bear with me. BattleCry, 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 BattleCry. BattleCry, 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 BattleCry. So what you're noticing right off the bat is the immediate feedback, the line tracking as it goes across, and the countdown of the 3 seconds. All of these things are giving feedback to the player of what they're supposed to do, how much time they have to do it. May still mess up on the first one, but once they see all of that information, the very next one goes much better. And then as we get into the game, you'll see where they can really take that to a mastery level. And ultimately, that was the goal of this, right? Was to have the ability for the BattleCry to be introduced, perfected, and mastered as far as the game mechanic was concerned. So that was a huge win for me. In-game transactional system, and the visual BattleCry was task 3059. We're going to look at 3060. And then we'll come back and talk about these. So I have my sectors I can select. I'll select that one. That one doesn't have one. Alright, so you'll notice that when I selected this one, this is grayed out. Because some of these games existed prior to the transactional system. That just means it wasn't tracking a BattleCry for that hex. So if you log into one of your older games, you're not going to see this capability. But as you attack other sectors, and it'll automatically play. It'll automatically play that battle cry for you once you pick an enemy sector. Now, if you come up here and you pick one of your sectors, well, I don't have one. Let's make one real quick. Sorry, looking through my camera and then trying to poke this sector is more challenging than it's like trying to work your hand in a mirror, it feels like. All right, I'm going to go to attack. Blah, blah. Blah, 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 blah. So you'll notice that where I was getting at from a mastery standpoint is the way I was controlling my battle cry, I was seeking larger infantry and larger archers. Now, to be honest with you, I chose poorly because cavalry worked better in planes than the other two guys. But the point is I can start to control how my battle cry works to conjure the troops that are best suited for that terrain type. And you'll notice a little green X popped up by my cavalry. That just means it's getting a terrain bonus. So I would really have liked to have had extra cavalry on a battle in plains from an attacking standpoint. And infantry get a terrain bonus from plains when defending. So it's kind of a touch and go from a strategic standpoint. Do I want to make sure I summon enough horde, which will ultimately become the garrison, to have a large infantry base to actually defend the territory when I win it, but I also need a large cavalry base to get as well. So the in-game transactional system, you'll notice that now I'm clicking on it, the button becomes active and I can play my own battle cry. So what's happening there is that if it's my own territory, it's not going to autoplay, but if it's an enemy territory, it will. And the goal is just to, as I'm inspecting and looking at various sectors, the expectation is I want to hear the battle cry of my enemy. I don't want to keep hearing my own battle cry over and over again. And I know it's kind of confusing because all these battle cries are mine. All right, so that's the in-game transactional system. Next milestone, we're going to have this button turn on where it's going to pop up a historical manifest of everything in sequential order. And if there's battle cries associated with those events, you can play them at that point. So that way you could get more than just the last battle cry. You would be able to see battle cries as they flipped back and forth. Ownership, constant battling for a sector, that sort of thing. All right, so let's go back up and look at the intuitive combat system that we've added. And I already attacked from there. Let's see if I've already eaten up all my guys. No, I didn't. Okay. All right, so in this point, what I'm doing is I'm looking at all of the sectors that surround the hex that you've selected, and I'm presenting icons to give you an idea of, one, to want to poke those sectors, and two, what those sectors will do once you poke them. If I poke the sector with the swords clashing, I can attack. If I poke the sector that is mine, I have the ability to reinforce. So the goal is hopefully that'll make it a little bit more intuitive to move around the map and do things. In addition to that, you'll notice that I've added where the visibility is, you're seeing a lot more of the map at one time than you were before. And that has helped significantly in visualizing the map. Okay, and that is the in-game transactional system. This will be a little bit easier to do from the iPhone once we get to it. And that is also the Intuitive Combat upgrade, which is feature 3061. And as you go through, you're hearing the sounds. You hear the combat sounds, the victory sounds. So that's task 3062. The friendly sector selection bug, we'll hit that when we go into the code review. Typo, we'll go over here and select forest. You'll notice I'm not actually calling it Froest anymore. And there we go. And you'll notice that it's not saying Thurn, it's saying Turn. So that's just some of the typos and fixes, and that's task 2998. And task 3099, the text visible in BattleCry, we'll take a look at that when we get back. Better affordances around what each list does, we'll take a look at that when we get back. And the game identification, active games, we'll take a look at that. So let's go ahead and end the game. So if we zoom in, we'll notice that there's no text on the new game or BattleCry button for the new game panel, and I found it in a couple other places. I'm sure there'll still be other places that it exists, but that was the key one that needed to be addressed. Better affordances around the list. I fully agree that, or at least I'm moving towards the ditch the challenge and response system and then just initiate a game to another player and then you go in and take your moves. But as far as being able to accomplish that at this juncture, I just don't think I have enough time on the clock to gut all of this and redesign it. So in this case, I'm really writing out your games waiting for a challenge, other players' games you can challenge, your completed games, your active games. So in the hopes that these titles are a little bit more informative and will drive the player to what's going on. And as they move from one list to the next, it goes beyond the pending and open, and there's some real descriptions there as to what's going on. The last piece is basically the game identification. One of the things early on that was identified as a potential problem is that if you're playing the same player in multiple games, there was no cue as to which game was which between that same player. And essentially, the most unique part of any game is the map. So what we are doing is rendering the map and showing you its water and its where the castles, and you can even see certain terrain ownership, such as on this one you can see that the bad guys have some hexes, and you can see that I've got some hexes surrounded by green. And that just generally, with the placement of the water and the mountains and things, just to give you kind of a bird's eye top view of what the topography looks like. And when looking at them from two different games played by the same players, at least it stands out as this one's this and the other one's that, so I know which game I'm going into. If if it's not your turn, it basically goes grayscale. And one of the changes this week I've been doing is I've been involving some user testing a lot more often throughout the development and introducing it to people through the week. Since we're down to our last 3 milestones, waiting to the end of 3 full milestones to really get user feedback is just too much time. So I've been sort of doing micro testing throughout the week, and one of the things that came out of it is these watermarks. So the first iteration of this was just gray and colored buttons, but a couple of the users had independently come up with, can you watermark it to let me know that I need to click it maybe, and they basically both came up with something that was like a VCR or play button from a regular movie or a play or something that's generally iconic that you can use. So that was essentially what came out of that, and that's task 2914, game identification. So that essentially sums up all of the various tasks for this milestone. Not a bunch of them, but there was a lot of work behind these. So let's go ahead and take a look at each one of these individually, and we'll see how it's put together. Hello, my name is Evan Schwartz. This is Milestone 7. We are looking at issue 3059. The audio I'm hoping it's not too loud in the background, so we'll see if we can't get through this. But essentially, this is testing out the BattleCry mechanic, and we'll be doing this from my iPhone. So here's pretty much the same mechanic that we saw on the Android. Pops up. Hello, 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 hello. Hello, 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 hello. And there it is. This is a new game. So that's basically it in action. That is issue 3059. Hello, my name is Evan Schwartz, and we're going to take a look at the visual BattleCry. So we're going to jump in and look at what we had to do here inside Unity. And we're going to expand out here, disable this guy, and let's take a look at the new game panel, and specifically the BattleCry panel. And you'll see that I turned that into a prefab. So a couple of the critical pieces here, this is just some basic UI work. I've got an image component. That's where I render out the waveform. I've got a countdown text component. The rest of these are buttons, exit buttons. Because I use a variety of dialogues, it's really a multi-burst dialogue, so there's a yes and no that gets enabled and turned on. But that's just for some of the other dialogue stuff. The point is to make this a prototype so that at some point when I go back in and reskin these, it'll be pretty straightforward on how to do that. All right, so how does it all put together? So each one of the little sections that drive this pretty much work the same way. So whether it's the active games list or open or pending or friends, they all use the show BattleCry script. So this is the script that essentially renders the recording for me and manages the countdown. This is what's being passed into it from the calling script. And this is just a timer that I set. It's mostly there just visible so that I can see it during debugging. Otherwise, it's handled within the script. So let's take a quick look at this script. This is really where the meat of it is. We'll let this boot up. So in the show BattleCry script, we've got our start BattleCry. This is how the calling script passes in the recording or the audio clip that it's recording to, and it basically maps that to the private variable, or in public in this case, and sets my time limit to 3 seconds. Since I'm not worrying about a variable time limit at this point, 3 seconds means pretty good. It's just set here, and then the stop BattleCry basically nulls it out and resets the time limit. Clearing the sprite, this just basically blows away the waveforms. That way if it's brought up again, it won't show the last waveform because it's really rendering it out there and pretty much calling it a day. This is just a little helper function to be able to fill my, my color block. So it's using, you'll see very similar bits and pieces when we see how it renders out the play button on the active list. So these arrays of colors is essentially the data on a pixel, right? And this is just sort of convenience to say, hey, well, however big that thing is, let's fill it up with this color, if that's what I'm trying to do. All right, so the meat and potatoes is in here, and this is all pulled out of my debug code, the visualizer that we built, I think in Milestone 5 or 6. So essentially, I'm doing units of 1. In this case, rather than having a frequency of 1, so you see all 24,000 samples, I'm doing a frequency of 60, so we're looking at every 60th sample. And that's the 24,000 divided by frequency, so that's basically 8,000 samples per second times 3 seconds. The height of my texture is just 200 pixels. The width is my width here, which this ultimately comes out to about 400, right? Is my width times my unit, in this case is 1. So this is mainly because I was playing around with it, trying to figure out what would be the best look to get that waveform to fill up that little texture file. So if there's no waveform, no recording, right? I get my time left, I instantiate a texture, I basically pull out all of my audio data from my recording samples. This is similar to what we're doing with the BattleCry, and that's what this little method does. This is just allocating it. Sorry about that. This is a counter, so I can keep up with what row I'm in from left to right. I guess I really should say column, because this is my, for all intents and purposes, is my X margin. And then essentially I start to iterate over my audio files. I'm basically trying to get their size. This is how tall they are. And so what I'm doing is I'm grabbing the absolute value, because they range from negative to positive, of that audio sample, and then I'm midpointing it halfway on the texture at line 100, and then essentially doubling its size. So I'm making it go up and down, as high and as low below the midpoint, manufacturing a midpoint at 99 in the texture to make it look like a proper wave file. Since I don't have floating point, this is sort of some trickery to make the integer math work. Essentially, I create my color block based on my block width, and that's what this is calculating. How tall is that line, right? So this is really just coming up with what's the total line height that I'm going to put at that particular point of J, left to right, across the audio file. This was my old for loop, so now I'm not really using this. I'm just filling my block color with red. And then just putting some try catch here. I was getting some errors, so I just needed to be able to log those errors. But essentially what this is doing is it's saying, hey, create a group of pixels that start at X. That's what this is. This is my X coordinate left to right on the texture. I want them to be 1 pixel wide. And then essentially I want to start at my midpoint, going up however tall it is, and then basically draw the entire length, which keeps it at a midpoint, using this array of pixels to draw. So this essentially draws a single vertical line at a specific point along my texture. This just makes sure I don't go outside the edge of the texture, and essentially all these lines get packed into the texture. All right, so this is me creating my track line. So what I'm doing here is I'm trying to figure out where I am in the span of things. Where's my recording at? I know the recording's 3 seconds, and I know I'm counting it down. So essentially, this little wizardry of math is just finding out what percentage of the time am I at, subtract that from the whole of the amount, so that I can put my track line right where I need it. If for any reason my math overflows, since it's this floating point and I'm rounding it, let's keep it within my bound box. And then essentially I create another block of pixels based on that height, which is the whole height. So I want the line to go from the top of the texture down to the bottom of the texture. So this is going to be the full 200. And I essentially fill out my track block with black since I'm on a whitish background. I set those textures, so I draw that line on the texture. Because I'm redrawing this texture over and over again as I'm recording, I'm only putting this at the point it needs to be, so it gets blown away and redrawn every time. I apply all of my sets to the texture. This is the waveform, so essentially this is a game object that's the image that you saw here. So that's essentially this guy right here, this white box. And as I put it in the new game object, I'm telling it what my waveform is. Right? And as long as I don't have, as I was playing around with it, depending on where the update is, it could go into the negative. This just makes sure that the time left never drops below 0. It's more visual for the user. And then formatting its output. And then essentially the update is calling this method over and over again, render BattleCry, over and over again. If there's nothing there, it just essentially gets in and steps out, so it's not very expensive. Which is why we call the stop BattleCry. So how does that work in the new game? How do I make all that magic come together? Go back up here, create new game. Let's go back up. There we go. All right, so the first thing that we do, this is after we've done process it, so this is sort of at the end. This is me grabbing my show BattleCry object, and then this is the stop. So once I get into processing it and calculating whether you've won or lost, this ends it, and there's the begin BattleCry that starts it, begin recording. So this just turns off the background music so it doesn't interfere with the recording. This starts the recording. This grabs the BattleCry, show BattleCry script object that we just saw, and then start BattleCry by passing this audio clip into the start BattleCry. And then as this yields for 3 seconds, everything in the background is still going on, so that allows the show BattleCry to render it. And essentially, that sort of kickstarts the whole process. The update runs in the background. You get your 3-second counter, and overall it's just a much better affordance type of thing. And if we go back into it, and I look at my countdown button, you'll notice that it's do begin recording is what it's actually going to play. Do begin recording is what starts the code routine to record, which is this, and it runs all this stuff. So that's how the button kind of works. And the closeout just basically, goes into the game object and sets its active to turn it off. So that's the visual BattleCry. This code is fairly consistent across the board. The loads are only a little bit different. If I look at my not load active, let's look at load pending. There we go. You'll see that I'm capturing all of this stuff, the pop-up text, the pop-up itself, yes, no, the BattleCry button, the close BattleCry button, the waveform, and the counter. And the whole purpose of that, and then of course here's the show BattleCry script, is so that I can pass these down into each individual list item, and it has access to that. Kind of set pending. So there we go. So that gives us the ability within our show BattleCry dialog to basically enable, remove all the listeners, wire up all my listeners for the clicks and so forth, so that they can essentially do the same thing. So if I'm going to, right here, let's go to definition on this. Essentially, this plays my click, this turns it interactive, and this starts the code routine. Begin recording, declaration, and here we go. Here's my SBC, start BattleCry, passing in this recording object, and then it calls the processing, declaration, and when it gets into here, it stops it. So all the BattleCries are wired up exactly the same way. They go through the same rigmarole of here's the pop-up, go through, do it, and it's just a matter of dropping these objects onto their controlling script. So if I'm not in a new game panel, deactivate this, and disable that. And since we just looked at pending, we'll look at pending. Let's go ahead and show that. And show its BattleCry pop-up, shockingly similar. So here's the scroll view. You'll see it has a show BattleCry script on it. It knows what its waveform image is. It knows where its countdowner is. And then this is where we just wire up all the pop-ups from this panel. And we just basically tell it where all the parts and pieces are so it can manage visibility, because this is a reused dialog for pretty much all of the pop-ups. And that's for all intents and purposes, is the exact same process on all of the panels. So that is issue 3059. Let's go ahead and move on to the next. Hello, my name is Evan Schwartz. This is Milestone 7. We're taking a look at issue 3060, in-game transaction system. So let's go ahead and log in. And again, I will do my best to talk over the audio as much as possible. So let's take a look at this guy. There's quite a few going on here. So this is my territory, and as you can see, I can play blah 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 battle cries, but they weren't played for me. So you can see some of these were older, but you can tell that one, for instance, has the tracking. That has the tracking. That one doesn't. That one doesn't. So looks like I was heading in this direction to be able to set that up. So now if I come over here to my enemy, this is me attacking. Blah, 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 blah. And that's the crux of it, is I want to, as I'm investigating or interrogating his territory, I want to hear and make that connection with the player. So that is in-game transaction milestone 7. Again, next milestone will hopefully have the entire docket where you can see a full history, but I don't see that being as critical. Thank you. Hello, my name is Evan Schwartz. This is Milestone 7. We're going to look at issue 3060, in-game transaction system. So this week, the goal of the in-game transaction system was to give the player immediate feedback regarding what was the last battle cry played on a given hex. And a very active game back and forth. Really, I don't need to always go back through the history of every hex. I just want to see what the most current activity is. So that's the thinking behind this. So this button here, right off of the main battle panel, basically allows them to go into the game controller and play the hex battle cry if there is in fact one. So we'll take a quick glance at that. So this is the play hex battle cry function, and it's just basically storing a local BCID. And what it does is it says, give me the hex I'm looking at, grab its hex logic, make sure it's not null, make sure I haven't got something out of whack there. Pull the BCID off of the hex, make sure it's not null, otherwise it's not null. Just to play the press button, because I plus this and it actually gets played automatically. And as long as I don't have an empty string, I will call out to my API library, passing in my BattleCry ID, and pass back to my on-request playback, which is out of thread, and it will play the audio. So that's basically the bulk of it, but there's a little bit more to it. Regarding whether or not it's going to play my hex battle cry or not. So we're going to do a little searching here. And in this case, here's our main function. This is the paint hex. So this is the piece that loads all of the data onto the main panel. And it is, of course, checking to make sure that the player hasn't been silenced. If you've had a chance to dig into some of the games this week, you'll notice that some of my testers went a little off rails. So this is an all too important ability to turn off those battle cries if they offend you. Essentially, it's going to grab the BCID to make sure that there is in fact one, and if there is one, it's going to make the button interactable. And if it's not my hex, so that's the rule we're playing. So if I don't own this hex, if it's a neutral savage hex or it's my enemy, then go ahead and play it for me. I want to make that connection to the other player. If it is my hex, I don't want you to play it. I still want to be able to click it if I want to hear myself for some reason, but I don't want to have to constantly hear myself or undergo the background task of having to go out to the server and load the audio file just to hear myself every time I click on the map. Otherwise, it disables the button. It doesn't play anything. So this is kind of the logic that makes that piece happen. And at the end of do combat, let's go ahead and take a look at that guy. As soon as I remember what my alphabet looks like. Getting ahead of myself, process recording. So as it goes through all of the standard processing, the first thing it does is it generates a BCID for the battle cry that was just made, that was processed, assigns it to the target hex, and then does an update and save. And that's kind of how it gets down there. And then, of course, updates the battle cries using the exact same BCID, and then sends that down to the database as well. And then this is just updating some visibility objects that I've got coming in and going out of there. So essentially, this is how a particular hex is tagged with the most recent battle cry for any type of combat situation, won or loss, and we'll let you know or have the ability to play it or replay it so you can make that connection to your opponent. That is issue 3069, in-game transactions. Next milestone, we'll actually be able to see the entire docket of a hex and be able to see all the history surrounding it. But that was the in-game transactions for this week. Thank you. Hello, my name is Evan Schwartz. This is Milestone 7, and we are looking at Task 3061, Intuitive Combat Movement Upgrade. We'll just go ahead and log in. Let's see if I have anything left here. Oh, good, I do. So as you can see, by default, it selects the castle hex, and what it's showing me all the way around is that I'm mostly surrounded by my own territory, thus the flags, but I also have this hex that I can attack, or I can target my home and target a neighboring sector that I own and do reinforcement. And let's see if I have anything near water. if I had something near water, let's go back and see if we can find another one that has me near water. I think that one will do. Yay for Minimap. So that's a much better example. Yeah. So as I've selected this hex, it's active. I can do stuff with it, but it has my two neighboring waters, which tell me, oop, I got an X there. I mean, I'm free to click on it, but it's not anything I can do with it. I've got my own forces that I can reinforce, or I can attack this hex. So again, the hope and dream here is that this is just pushing the user to want to click on these icons and see what they do. And that's just better than what we had before, which was just a blinky hex with nothing around it to give you the indication to even bother to look at it. Alright, that is issue 3061, Intuitive Combat Movement Upgrade. Thank you. Hello, my name is Evan Schwartz. This is Milestone 7, and we are looking at issue 3061, Intuitive Combat Movement Upgrade. So, the way that this works now is that when you select a particular hex, it looks at the potential of all the hexes around them. So what happens is we call out this method, show potential, which passes in the X and the Y of the selected hex. And it makes sure that your hex is active and it's yours, right? It's not going to allow you to do things from non-owned hex. Then it goes to the rigmarole, am I looking at an even or odd hex, because on a hex map that sort of adjusts on the Y side particularly which sectors around that hex I need to look at. And then it sets out to say set the potential for those various plus or minus x's, all the x's around it. And essentially that calls this method here, which adjusts for the zero-based array, makes sure that I don't want to have to worry about in here whether I'm below or above the X on every single call type of thing. That just muddies this up. So I just do that check here. So this is always checking all the way around it, even if I'm on a border hex. But if it just goes off into the wildlands, it just won't even bother to call the change potential. So this map objects is a two-dimensional array of my hex logic, and on my hex logic I have this change potential. And so what's the potential and is it mine? So let's just go back real quick. And I'm saying yes, let's change the potential to true, and is it mine? Right? And if it is mine, what it's doing is and again, when I say is it's mine, it's looking at the hexes around me. Right? So the first thing it's doing is potential equals true. It's just basically establishing it. And then it's setting up the icons. It's defaulting them all to off. So there's three different icons. There's a you can't go there, that's water or something you can't move into. It's an enemy or it's a friendly hex, and essentially that creates the iconography within those hexes. And if is potential and the status is active and it's mine, I'm going to set it as friendly. If it's active and it's not mine but it's water, it's going to be a no-go. Or if it's not water, sorry, it's going to be enemy, and if it is water, it's going to be a no-go. Now, in the interest that it isn't active, right? There's still a couple of things I can do. So I'm going to turn everything off because it's essentially nothing. It's not in an active state. But if it's mine and it's not active, I could still potentially move troops there, right? So if it has taken its move, but a hex that I'm selecting hasn't, it can still reinforce that hex, even though that hex has taken its move. It can be the receivership of reinforcement. So that sort of manages that behavior. Now, essentially, these are all individual game objects, right? Just yes or no. So if we shoot over on into the map, and I look at my various terrain bits and pieces. Let me find one here. Here we go. Take a look at the hex pasture. So we now have these little constructs, and they're easier to see here. Just turn them on and go back that way. So there's the friendly, there's the combat, and then there's the no-go. And all of my little hex pieces have that, and what that does, and since I have that as part of each one of my my hex logics, that gives me the ability to dig in. Let's just maybe take one more look at that and show that again. And as you can see here, this is the hex logic script that I have on my individual prototype, and I have all the mappings to my no-go, combat, friendly, and all the various parts and pieces that I need to be able to control the script. And that's essentially all I'm doing, is managing visibility based on whether or not the selected hex sees potential in its surrounding hexes. And that makes it pretty straightforward. All right, thank you. Again, that is Task 3061, Intuitive Combat. Hello, my name is Evan Schwartz. This is Milestone 7, and we're going to look at issue 3062, the sound effects. So right away, you should be hearing the background music kick in here on the login page, and the little clicking noises that allow me to tick and get a feel that I'm pressing on buttons. Let me go into combat. I've got one here, I've got one over there, good. Alright, so I'm going to try to lose this one. Attack, so I'm not going to make any noise here. Alright, let's see, that I should probably lose that. And as you can hear, the fights in the background, the punching noises, and the crows you lost. So that's a nice little hollow, terrible sounding loss. Another sound is the purchasing of dwarf. You hear some coinage. Let's go here. I hear the same thing. How much money I got? Oh, I got plenty. Wall, so you can hear the little swishy noises. And let's exit out of this. We've heard the battle cries. Let's go into this one. Thinking. And let's just target that. Let's attack it. We're going to win it this time. Fight. And the little trumpet sound that you've won, and you own it. So for the most part, between the clicking, the background music, the ambient noise, the punching, the horns, the crows, and the change, that's pretty much the bulk of the sound within the game today. All right, thank you. Hello, my name is Evan Schwartz. This is Milestone 7. We're going to take a look at issue 3062, which is essentially adding sound. So let's go ahead and dig into it. The first thing I created was an audio manager script. This just basically stores all of my various audio samples. It basically exposes real easy to manage one-shot plays of those samples, and sort of abstracts me from the knowledge or the complications of, is this a background channel, or is this a sound effects channel, or is this ambient channel, any of that stuff. So once I've got my audio manager script here, I've got my sound, background, and ambient. So these are all of my audio sources that I need to manage. And then of course I have all of my sound samples. So all of my audio sources are using my game audio mixer. We'll come up here and take a look at that. And essentially the way the audio mixer works, and it's a real handy tool, is it allows me, under my master volume and various special effects or what have you, I just usually set up my three audio channels, just ambient, background, usually footsteps, wind, things that have really nothing to do with the game, that just sort of add some depth to it. My background music, which you guys have been hearing quite a bit, and then my sound effects. And then I just create some events off of my sound effects, and I send those events to my background channel, my ambient channel, and I just tell them to duck volume. And what that really does when I dig into it, it allows me to control, when I do a sound effect, how to lower down the volume of my ambient and background tracks to really give favor to my sound effects and then have them pump back up. This also allows me, from a master volume perspective, to manage the overall volume. Put that back where I had it. And my ambience versus my background, and of course here's my sound effects, which I want to take center stage in the thing. The background to kind of fall in the background. But this also, once I've got this set, I don't have to go to all of my sound everywhere. I can just come here and sort of mix them and play with them and get them to a point where I'm very, very comfortable with it. I'm not going to say I'm 100% there yet. There's some still tweaking. I think the background music might be a little too much, but I want to get it on a few of my testers' devices before I make that call. Okay, so the wire up inside, here's my audio mixer, here's all my audio samples, and then I've got my audio source and my audio manager. So let's take a quick look at the audio manager and see how that works. So again, keeping track of my various audio sources. So I've got a play background. This is a stop all that turns off all the music that was critical for generating battle cries. This is stop all sounds. This stops everything except for my background music. And then this is play sounds. This plays on my sound channel. And this is play ambience, obviously. It plays on my ambience channel. And then I've just got my higher level functions, which, play coin spill, play hands of time, blah, blah, blah. Play button press. This is sort of an abstraction on top of an abstraction. It gave me an opportunity to play around with what I think would be a better sound. I had radio hit to begin with. Yeah, that got a little old quick. So I just went with the sort of slate click noise, and that seems to be a lot better. So essentially, every one of the scripts accesses my audio manager. So let's take a quick peek. Any one of these scripts would do. So got a nice little search set up here, moving infantry target down. These are all my little button clips, and I'm just am.play button press, and boom. And I just add that wherever I want a little click or a little sound to occur. Let me go, yeah, I'm just playing slate directly there. That's on my hex click. Button press, button press, button press. There's all kinds of button presses. Let's get to the combat here. Do combat. So in the do combat, this plays my ambient background battle. So all the clinging and cheering and fighting, I just put that as background ambience. The music still plays, and then all the sound effects for the punches kind of sound pretty neat. And we'll go into declaration here. So this plays the punch on the producing of hit, and every time a hit is produced, you get a little punch noise, and that's essentially every time an X pops up, boom, 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 and the things shake. So the sound just adds an extra little depth to it. But this makes it real easy for us to just be able to put sound anywhere within the game, working with my three primary channels of sound, background music, and ambience, and then I can use my audio mixer to really tweak that out as we get more and more around the game. In a variety of devices, I find that the sound tends to play a little differently depending on the device, so somewhere in there should be a pretty good sweet spot. But that's pretty much it on the sound. It's high speed, low drag, not a lot of work there. But the key was having an audio manager that I can use to centralize all of my sound logic. And then again, as if the game gets to be more complicated, I'll do more of this type of stuff to abstract myself from a very specific sound, like play punch. This is what I want a button press to sound like. But this so far seems to be the only one that was of real need on that, and it allows me to replace this one sound, and it replaces every. Okay, that's issue 3062, Add Sound. So I appreciate it. Let's take a look at that in the game. Hello, my name is Evan Schwartz. We're going to look at issue 3094 real quick. Unfortunately, it's a bug that I fixed, so that makes it very difficult to demonstrate, but I'll try to make the point with the working version. So essentially the problem was this. I could target my sectors. I've got my castle targeted here, and I could pick a neighboring sector which would go into reinforce. But if I tried to go one step too far, it left my castle, where the hex on the castle, blinking, even though it had successfully moved my source location because I had overreached, right? I had gone too far and assumed, okay, you must be selecting a new source. So everything else worked except for leaving that other hex, the original hex, blinking, which was just confusing. So that was what the bug was. And that was a fairly easy fix once we realized that we were orphaning the source and failing to turn the source off before setting up a new source. So essentially that was just a quick fix. That's issue 3094. Thank you. Hello, my name is Evan Schwartz. This is Milestone 7. We're looking at issue 3094. It was a friendly sector selection bug. And essentially what was happening is that you could select a friendly sector as your source sector. You could select a friendly sector as a target sector nearby. And then you could select another friendly sector that was too far away. And it would select it, but it would leave the source selector in the appearance that it was selected. It was just blinking, but it wasn't really selected. So essentially what we failed to do is on the target here is when we set the new hex, the one that we were targeting as the secondary hex, we were targeting it as selected, but we were not turning off the source selected to make the blink go away so that it becomes the new source selected, and then essentially disables those entirely and allows that to be the new selected hex. And what we were doing prior is we were just nulling these out and orphaning, so to speak, the selected behavior, doing pretty much the same thing here, if not valid unless original source, and select new source. So there was a couple of places where we had to essentially disable the source selecting as false, set the new one as true, and then reassign the source. We weren't doing that properly, which allowed for that behavior. So that was just a bug, documented it here, and that's really the crux of it into the code. Thank you. That's issue 3094. Hi, my name is Evan Schwartz. This is Milestone 7, and we are taking a look at issue 2914, Game Identification for Active Games. The premise behind this was to give players that are playing multiple games together a convenient way to know which game they're currently invested in. So as I look through my games here, I will look for one. Here's one right here. I've got, I'm looking at the one that's 4 from the bottom, or the second active one from the bottom up. So you see this little jig-jaggy pattern of swamps. I see this little boomerang-looking piece of water here right around the play button. So I'm going to go ahead and kick in there and confirm that that's looking pretty much the way I want it to look. So I've got my swamp pieces. So there's my 2x2x1. That looks right. And here's my boomerang of water. So right away, I have a pretty good feel for this being the map that I was just looking at. So let's go ahead and exit back out and take a look just to reconfirm. And sure enough, so there's everything that I'm seeing there on that little mini map is corresponding to the map itself. So that gives me some good correlation between the game that I'm playing and the map that I'm playing on, particularly if I'm playing the same player quite a bit. The 1 second from the bottom is equally as identifiable. Cluster of water, cluster of swamps, cluster of water. Let's take a look at that. So at the bottom, here's a cluster of water, here's swamps, here's a cluster of water, and there's my swamps. So looks pretty solid, and it sticks out pretty well, so that gives me something that I can identify to. So it seems to be doing quite well around what I think its original purpose was, and adding the watermarks onto it has helped to give affordances for players to click on them or not click on them. Okay, that is issue 2914, and thank you for your time. Hello, my name is Evan Schwartz. This is Milestone 7. We're going to look at issue 2914. Issues 3004, better affordances around each list category. You saw that in several of the videos already. It's just declarative markup in the Unity editor. It's static text. Text visible in the BattleCry icon, that's issue 3099. It's not there. I showed that in an earlier video. And the issue of 2998 typo, Frois needs to be fixed to Forest, and Thurn should be turned. We've seen that several times throughout several of the videos. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time. Those are really just typos, oversights, and setting things active. But for game identification, and that's issue 2914, there's quite a bit of meat to that. And we'll take a look at the set active for that particular piece. So the crux of it is we've got a variety of little helper routines. So we've got our little watermark, and I'm still given proper credit here for this. I probably wouldn't have gone this way had I not found this, but I ended up tanking all the code that was in here because essentially I'm not really sure where it was going with it, but after I ran it, it essentially turned this into this, which didn't feel like a watermark to me. So I rewrote it to be able to go, and I'm basically working on a 64 by 64 switch, so this needs to be less than that. And essentially it's grabbing the background pixel, and it's grabbing the watermark pixel. And I'm defaulting the final color to the background because I'm using black or alpha less than or equal to 0 as clear. In which case the only time I'm lerping at 50% is if it's not black and it's not an alpha, or if it's an alpha greater than 0. In which case I'll just lerp between the background and the watermark color, give me a 50% lerp on that, and then that'll be kind of the final color. And that did a pretty good job at generating those X's and those triangular watermarks, and we'll see that in a minute. And then essentially once I update all those pixels, apply the updates, and return the background. So you'll see what that is. The other big one was my create hex. So this is, each one of the little hexes on the minimap is an 8x8. So I just basically plotted out on graph paper a hex, outlined it in white, and gave it a default color of green. And then based on what you pass in as background, hex, ownership, or whether or not it's a grayscale version, I'm just doing a replace of those colors to the colors passed in, and if it's grayscale, then I take the grayscale value of that and reset it back to itself. Excuse me. Okay, so that basically creates a little hex for me. All right, so create playable. That was a failed attempt at a watermarking, so I'm not going to worry about that for now. So this is the render action button, and what this does is this is called during the load to basically update the play button. And so this is the crux of it. So I'm basically saying it's an 8x8 texture because my hex is 8x8, but my units are 8 because the hexes that I generated up here are 8x8 or 64 total pixels. So I'm an 8x8 in units. So I create my texture, which is essentially width 8 times unit 8. So it's 64 by, so the whole thing is 64 by 64. And that sort of stubs out my texture. I have access to my map at this point, so I begin to iterate over my map, and I get my coordinates out of my map because it helps me place everything. This is where I initialize my background, my hex color, who owns it, and this is, again, my block array. We saw that from the BattleCry. This is just a holder of pixel data, so I know what color it's going to be. I figure out whether or not the owner color is green or red or yellow. Either it's mine, it's an enemy's, or it's unowned. My forests are dark green. My mountains are gray. My swamps are yellow, and my waters are blue, and my hexes, castles are white. And then everything else, including the plains, at this point I kept dark green because as it just got a little weird. I may still play around with this green color for the plains color, but right now it looked too busy, and the patterns to me really are the water and the mountains. So I wanted those to pop, a little bit more than really the 4s, but I'm notating that I may come back to that. Whether or not it's interactable, so in other words, is it my turn, is really what this button is telling me. And if it isn't my turn, I'm going to say yes to the grayscale. So give me a block, give me a hex that's grayed out. Otherwise, no, give me a hex that's properly colored with my background hex and ownership. And then I go through the same rigmarole as rendering out my real map. Is it an even X or an odd X, which slightly adjusts where I put my Y units, and I even have a little bit of an offset since I'm 0 based on the X, is if I'm X greater than 0, I'll just bump it in one. It had some weird spacing between each column. So I just took, this is just a, leading, for lack of a better term. And once I've gotten all of my my entire map rendered out, I apply the textures, and then if it's interactable, so this again is me saying if it is my turn, I'm going to put the watermark to play. If it isn't my turn, I'm going to put the watermark to no. So let's take a look at where I'm getting those from. So we need to go to a different scene. Wait for a second. So on my load script, load active games, I have my watermark play and watermark no. This is my play button. This is my attack wing button. And these textures, or these sprites, are 64 by 64, which makes them real handy. No, I didn't mean to do that. Which allows me to come in here and you can see that their max size is 64, and this guy, 64. Interesting thing, just not all pings are created equal. Here's my play. I needed to actually specifically state RGBA 32-bit for this guy. Didn't have to do that for the X. He sort of came in okay. And the weird thing is the only way I was able to identify that as a problem is when I came into here, just as a heads up, got some more information here. See where it says RGB 32-bit? Well, it didn't say that before. I noticed that my X was working, but my triangle was not. And it was, not yet compressed, blah, 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 ping, and it was a 60 by 64 32-bit. So that led me to push the compression thing for this guy and make it a 64 by 64 32-bit, and that seemed to do the trick. So at that point, this is how you assign it, and then these get called in by the holder graphic right off of the, because we're in the set active data item. So the holder is the loading script, load active games, and it just grabs these twos and watermarks them over top of the texture. And once that texture has been finalized, it just updates the action button sprite to that particular texture. So that's really the whole thing in a nutshell. It's just rendering out a texture. The real challenge here was getting my head wrapped around how this block concept works. So essentially, you're creating technically a two-dimensional array of pixels and putting them onto the texture in chunks. So I've become used to, here's a pixel, here's a line, here's a circle, here's a square type of drawing functions on a canvas of type. So originally I was treating the texture 2D like a canvas, which made it a little bit more challenging. But once I was able to get my head wrapped around how this worked, it was pretty straightforward. So again, like I said, I'm still gonna play around with these colors a little bit. The goal is to really have a landmark view of those little buttons so that they pop at you and they look like the map. So we may revisit this in a future milestone. Okay, that is the game identification active games, and other than it running this in the load active, which is here, de-render action. So as it's creating each one of my datums, adding them to the list, it just calls that render action once, generates its new sprite, and attaches itself to the button. So it sounds more complicated than it is once you tear it apart, but that's it in a nutshell. All right, thank you, guys. That is Milestone 7. I hope you enjoyed it this week, and looking forward to next week. Thank you.